Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today we want to talk about language. And language really is the building block of modern society. I mean, it's great that we have big brains and all of this stuff, and then we can problem solve and we can make tools. But really, the one thing that drives our species forward is our ability to communicate in such complex ways, such sophisticated ideas. So, first of all, when we talk about communication of ideas, we're talking about culture, really, and culture is based on symbols. And a symbol is something verbal or nonverbal within a culture that is going to come to stand for something else, like wedding rings, crucifixes, a red and white striped flag with white stars on a blue field, perhaps a bat on a yellow field. For those of you that like comics, you'll know what I'm talking about. But anyway, when we talk about language, right, we are in fact talking about a symbol. And it is the primary means by which culture is actually transmitted from one generation to another. We teach our children through language, and those children will grow up and teach their children through language. And so, language, these words, are symbolic replacements for meanings. Everything that I am saying to you now, hopefully, means something to you, gives you some sort of idea in your mind. Now, here is your first question. Which relies least on symbolism to convey information? A flag features a skull and crossbones and an hourglass. A tool you own sports a sticker with a lightning bolt on it. A friend sends you a text full of emoticons, or you flip through a dictionary. Well, in this case, flipping through a dictionary is not actually going to tell you anything specific. It is a list of all of these symbols, but it doesn't actually convey any meaning to you. You're just, looking up words. But when you see a flag with a skull and crossbones, that should tell you a pirate. And with the hourglass, it means you have a very limited time before piratey things happen to you. Sticker with a lightning bolt, that tells you that you have a shock risk, right? It's electrical. If you get a text full of emoticons, and you do, they're telling you something, winky face, sad face, happy face, whatever, right? Those are all things that have messages. And so it's not just about having a symbol, it's about having the symbol mean something. Okay, so when you say what is language, you're really talking about a set of symbols, a whole group of them that allow people to express ideas and to think and communicate with each other in very sophisticated or not sophisticated, as the case may be, ways. And it can be verbal or nonverbal. Verbal is what I'm doing right now. Nonverbal is what you're reading off of the screen. Now, languages, there are classifications of languages, and as a science person, scientist, I really enjoy classifying things. Well, it turns out so do all other scientists and lots of other people too. So languages are classified, and we classify them actually very much the way that we would classify organisms, and that is by their origin and historical relationship. We classify organisms by their evolutionary relationships, but in some ways this is very similar. There are proto-languages, which are ancestral tongues, and then modern languages will have arisen from those proto-languages, just like you have a common ancestor, and then modern species arise from that. And then here, I just put this on there just to show you that there are lots and lots of language groups, and we could have a whole class just about language groups. And here are the big major categories, okay? We're going to deal mostly with the Indo-European because most of us, that's going to include many of the languages that we speak. The next most likely group would be the Sino-Tibetan, and that's going to include Chinese and Korean and all of the Asian languages. But like I said, we're going to focus on Indo-European because the majority of the world actually does speak some sort of Indo-European language. That's about 48%. When we talk about Indo-European, there are really two groups here. You have this kind of what I like to think of as the European group, right? And if you'll notice, English is right down here, arising from West Germanic. And you can see that there's actually a connection here. You have a little bridge. How are these related? I don't know. Look, this looks just like a phylogenetic tree. Yay! Now, you should recognize lots of languages. Some of them we offer here. But this is only half of the Indo-European language set. Oh, by the way, anything that's got a dagger on it, that's completely extinct. Yeah? And we'll talk about extinct languages in just a second. And then here is the other half, okay? So these are going to be your Eastern language. So we've kind of got the Western European, now we've got the Eastern European over here, okay? All right, and this I just really like is the picture of the tree, because these are like trees of life. You have language trees. And so if you look at all the languages as being this tree right here, this is going to be that list of languages I just showed you. Now, there is a relationship between culture and language, right? For many people, the language that they speak is the primary indicator of the culture that they belong to, right? And in many cases, people will learn new languages, but they will hold on to their original languages because that is their culture. And there's a fear that if you become attached to or become more, not more fluent, but you use another language more, then you lose your own culture. And so lots of cultural groups try and retain their own languages even after any other cultural markers are actually gone, right? And here's a nice map that I like. In 2011, these are the percentages of people who were speaking a language other than English at home. Okay, so why do people preserve languages, right? It's really about that culture kind of idea, but it's also the same kind of reason that you would more or less save anything that was endangered cultures, endangered species. Although I'd like to point out with endangered species, lots of times you risk losing other species, which is not necessarily true with languages, but it's the same idea. You're preserving history, you're preserving heritage, okay? And there are really two things that are happening in terms of endangered languages. First of all, there are lots of extinct languages, and almost 500 languages actually today are endangered. But there are two things that people are doing. They're reviving languages that are no longer, and an extinct language is no longer spoken actively, right? So Latin, you see Latin, lots of things are written in Latin. There are things written in Hebrew, but it's not something that is an actively spoken day-to-day kind of thing. It's a scholarly language, right? And so there is the idea that they used to be everyday languages, and so we'll start doing those. And then preserving the languages that are still being spoken, but are dwindling, okay? And then you also have isolated languages, which turn out to be completely unique from other languages, and so those are very interesting too to linguists, and Basque and Icelandic are two examples of those. Now, there are standard languages and variant languages. I mean, the standard language is the official language. It's going to be the language of instruction, government, public activities, and in many places there's more than one standard language, or there isn't actually a real standard language, but there are languages that are used most. Now, when we start talking about variant languages, we're really kind of talking about something called linguistic geography, and this deals with vernacular dialects. So these are going to be social dialects that might be like teen speak or surfer speak or something like that. But then there are also geographic and regional dialects, and this is something that we're going to look at more as we start looking at things like slang. But anyway, that would be like, if you're from the South, you have all of these words that go with the South. If you're from the Northeast or the North or out West, same idea, okay? These just happen to be regional, whereas social happens to be non-regional. And they can actually overlap, but there's the difference. Now, these dialects have what are called isoglosses, right? These are words that are not used nationally. They have a kind of a regional distribution, all right? And so y'all is kind of a good example of that. It's not a word that's used nationally. It has regional boundaries, okay? Most of the time, all of these vernacular dialects, the isoglosses, are going to relate to either what's going on in rural life or food or objects from daily life or daily activities, things like that, okay? Now, the other thing that you want to know about language, there's something called the lingua franca. This is the language of trade. And your lingua franca will be the language that is the connection between people who do not have a common language. Oftentimes, for some of the parties involved, it's going to be a second or third language, okay? All right, so today, the predominant lingua franca, or the language of trade, is going to be, well, English, actually. And so today, we see English as this dominant language of trade, and many, many, many people around the world speak English. Before, though, it was French, and before that, it was Latin. And so that's why you have lingua franca instead of the dominant language. But it was French for a long time, and that was the language of, the trade, the dominant there. Anyway, so we'll talk a little bit more about this later on as we start talking about development exchange in the next unit. So if this is a little bit confusing or you're not sure of the history, that's okay. You just need to know what it is right now, what that means. Okay, and then here's just an example of where English is official and most widely used, places where it's not official, right, but widely used, and places where it is official, but no one uses it. Okay, so what about the evolution of a language? I think English is really a very good example of this. First of all, there are gradual changes and they are cumulative, right? And so before the 18th century, the English language actually gained thousands of words from Latin, from Greek, from French, from other European languages that the English were coming in contact with. Because remember, England's an island, and so they were kind of isolated. But then as you start having trade, you start incorporating these other words. But after the discovery of new lands and they start getting colonized, we start to see all sorts of other words come in from the colonies. And so you may be talking about Asia, like India, America, Australia, Africa. Okay, so English, though, is not always the same, right? We, in America, ride in an elevator. If you are in England, you ride in a lift. We carry a flashlight, they carry a torch. We think a torch is something on fire. We have a hood of our car, they have a bonnet. For us, that's something that you wear on your head. We have a trunk of the car, they have a boot. I like to wear boots on my feet, don't really keep it in my car. So differences can be really prevalent in languages that have been isolated for a period of time. Obviously in America, we have developed our own words, and in England, they have their own words. And so again, it's a lot like species. You have these isolated populations that are not having this daily language flow. Yeah? And actually, that's even true within the United States. I think this is the really best example, and it is, in fact, the textbook example, which is why you have a picture here. But Cokes, like here, we drink Cokes, and when you walk, you go to somebody's house, you say, hey, do you want a Coke? Yes, I want a Coke. What kind of Coke do you want? I would like a Dr. Pepper. Dr. Pepper is not Coke, but here, a Coke means soda. In other places, it's pop, because it used to be soda pop, right? And there are all kinds of things that you get like this. A water fountain can be a bubbler, or it can be a water fountain. So it really just depends. Anyway, but this is a good example. And you can also see here that this is a vernacular dialect sort of thing, right? Here you've got your Cokes, here you've got your pops, here you've got your soda, soda, soda. Okay, now there are other things that are problematic when you start talking about languages, and those are going to be idioms. If you've ever learned another language, and I think most everyone has, at least studied one, if not become fluent in one, there are all of these phrases that when you directly translate them, they are crazy town. If you had a visitor coming in and you were telling a story about somebody who shot his mouth off, that would be horrific. That would be absolutely terrible, right? They would not understand that what you mean is it's somebody who just, blurted out whatever they wanted to say. A bun in the oven sounds delicious. Here it's a baby. That's weird. So these are real problems in translations between languages, and sometimes even between regions, right? And especially if you think about the South. The South has lots and lots and lots of things that are problems for people speaking, quote, the same language in other places. Now, other variant languages are going to include amalgams, right? An amalgam is a mashup of two languages. And the first amalgam that you will encounter in this sort of evolution of language is a pidgin language. And that is a mixture of two languages, again, for the purpose of trade. And so you have this kind of contact language. It's very rudimentary. It's very simple. It's very much like baby talk, right? And I think the best example that you will be familiar with is Spanglish, right? People who do not speak English and people who do not speak Spanish, when they're trying to speak to each other, really baby talk and try and figure it out and use a mix of what they know. That's very common. right? And then relexification is what is actually happening in these languages. You start mixing the vocabulary, and so some words you're going to replace with new vocabulary, some words you're going to keep. Now, a creolized language, which is our next amalgam that we want to talk about, arises when a region becomes a colony, a pidgin becomes the primary language for children, when a language is mixed with English, when more than one language is spoken in the home. A creolized language, a Creole language, is when a pidgin actually becomes the dominant language, okay? And so Creole languages are descendants of pidgins, and they are stable. They often become the native language of the area, and a really good example, and a pretty unique example actually, is an English Creole here in the United States that is called Gullah, or Geechee, and it is this English Creole with African tongues, and so it's really interesting because it's Elizabethan English and then the native African tongues, and so languages, and it is the only surviving example of an English-based Creole language in North America, and it's really interesting to hear spoken. And then French Creole is the Louisiana Creole, which is based predominantly on Haitian Creole, okay, and so you've got a combination there as well, but that's a French Creole. Now that we have all of these languages and we're all communicating and we're all talking, what are we actually communicating? So there's a social meaning of language. And so the question, which should have a question mark, does language affect people's perception of reality? Studies actually find that there were several studies done that college students would look at job descriptions, and if they were written in masculine pronouns, the general feeling was that women were not qualified for the job. And this is a real problem, by the way, in STEM fields, in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. There are a lot of women that think, "Ooh, I can't do that," because a lot of times it's a man thing, and we kind of reinforce that with our language, because language reflects the social and political status of different groups in society. The term working woman, right? I mean, if you have a job, you're a working woman, but that suggests that women who don't work for money aren't working. So by that argument, you would say that stay-at-home mothers don't work, and women who stay home to care for like elderly parents or invalid, family members don't work. And that's absurd, because as a mother, I can tell you, moms work really hard and caregivers work really hard, but they don't make money. So this is a very interesting thing that language does, right? And groups can actually advocate changing language because it can be negative when they want something positive. And the disabled, right, was originally called handicapped, and actually now disabled is special needs, right? And so those have actually changed too, because over time, sometimes, even if you've changed a word to have a more positive meaning, it will eventually take on a negative meaning and then has to be changed again. Yeah. Now, language will shape perceptions about events as well, not just groups, but also events. And the textbook example for this too is that Columbus discovered America. Well, he did discover it for the Europeans at the time, but he didn't discover it as a brand new country with no one there. Lots of societies, or not societies, but lots of cultures had actually discovered it before that, and there were many Native American societies that were there prior to Columbus being there. And so when we say Columbus discovered America, we actually know what we mean, but you have to be careful sometimes with that sort of thing. And then, of course, gender is back to the whole, working woman idea. I was using gender there, but really when you start talking about gender, there's the use of man, right, in words like chairman. Yeah, mankind is probably okay because I don't know, but there is this connotation that men are dominant in that, and the use of pronouns of he and she really do affect people. For example, nurses and teachers are almost always referred to as she, whereas doctors, lawyers, and CEOs are almost always referred to as he, and so that kind of sets up this difference because people don't look at those jobs as being equal, and I think you can see where we're going with that. Okay, so enough about culture. Let's talk back about geography. The language of the landscape, or language on the landscape, because we're talking about naming things, is toponymy, right? And toponyms are place names. Toponymy is the study of place names, okay? And you will actually be doing a little activity where you look at the toponyms in our area and try and figure out what those say about our region, Okay, but here's your last question. Which is not something named for a place? A maraschino cherry, the term to balkanize, bohemian, a Labrador retriever, or damask, which is a lovely fabric? Well, we'll start at the bottom. Damask, which is something you probably are familiar with, is a type of like embroidered style fabric. It is from Damascus, so place. Labrador retriever, from the Labrador Islands. Dog lives there. There you go. Bohemian. Bohemia is today, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, that area, what used to be Czechoslovakia. To balkanize, right? That's referring to the Balkans. Yeah. Maraschino cherries, on the other hand, refer to the tree itself. So that looks like it could be named for something, but it's not. Everything else is named for a place. Okay, so that's it. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you next time in class. Thanks for listening.